Unit 3, Latin America, Lesson 13, Life in the Central Andes, Adapting to a Mountainous Region. Introduction. La Paz, Bolivia is the highest big city in the world, sitting at 12,000 feet above sea level in the Central Andes Mountains of South America. This high elevation can produce some odd effects. Golfers in La Paz can hit a golf ball much farther than they can at sea level. At a nearby ski resort, a skier may need to wear an oxygen tank to go skiing. These effects are the result of thin air. The air is thinner at high elevations because the force of gravity pulls air downward, which means that the air at high elevations has less oxygen. This is why the skier in La Paz requires an oxygen tank. The thin air is also the reason a golf ball will travel farther at 12,000 feet. At that elevation, there is less air to cause friction on the ball and slow it down. The people of La Paz are accustomed to living at high elevations. Like all of the people who live in the Andes Mountains, they have adapted to the effects of high elevation. The Andes include some of the highest mountain peaks in the world, with many of them rising much higher than La Paz. The various elevation levels in these mountains influence the way people live. In this lesson, you will read about life in the Central Andes. You will also learn about altitudinal zonation, a term that refers to the division of mountainous land into zones based on altitudes or elevations. You will find out about the 4 main elevation zones in the Andes and how the people living there have adapted to each zone. The essential question for this lesson is, how do people adapt to living in a mountainous region? The diagram here, our graphic organizer, shows the Andes Mountains of South America. We can see that the mountain is divided into 4 different zones based on elevation. Each zone has its own average range of temperatures and its own distinct plant and animal life. The features of each zone influence how people live. We're thinking about this diagram as we try to answer, how do people adapt to living in a mountainous region? We can see our graphic organizer. Our bottom at 0 to 3,000 feet is Tierra Caliente, which is usually about 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. We go up 1 level to Tierra Templada, which is 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and is 3,000 feet above sea level to 6,000 feet. 1 level above that is Tierra Fria, which is 55 degrees to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, sitting at 6,000 to 12,000 feet. So this top part connecting Tierra Fria and Tierra Helada is where La Paz sits. And then we have Tierra Helada, which is 20 degrees to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and the elevation is 12,000 to 15,000 feet high. Can't forget our geoterms for this lesson. We have altitudinal zonation, the division of land into zones based on elevation, which in turn helps determine climate and vegetation. Snowline, the lowest elevation on mountains where snow remains year-round. Terracing, the creation of flat areas on mountain slopes for the purpose of farming. Treeline, the highest elevation where trees grow on a mountain. And vertical trade, the trading of crops between lowland and highland areas. Part 1, the geographic setting. South America, the world's 4th largest continent, encompasses 12 countries and a wide range of environments. The continent has deserts, tropical rainforests, and several mountain ranges, with the highest mountains being the Andes. The Andes consist of several mountain ranges that are known in Spanish as cordilleras. These cordilleras form the longest chain of high mountains on Earth, stretching approximately 4,500 miles from north to south along the west coast of South America. The Andes have appropriately been nicknamed the backbone of South America. The Andes Mountains pass through 7 countries, featuring many different landscapes along the way. Some parts of the Andes are covered with dense forest, whereas other regions are rocky and bare. More than 50 mountains within the Andes reach elevations of more than 20,000 feet, and these lofty peaks are always covered with snow and ice. The Andes can be grouped into three sections: the Northern Andes, which cross Venezuela and Colombia, the Southern Andes, which runs through Chile and Argentina, and the Central Andes, which covers Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. This lesson focuses on the Central Andes. In the introduction, we read about altitudinal zonation, learning that there are four main elevation zones in the Andes. These elevation zones, which are illustrated in the diagram in this section, are also called climate zones because elevation helps determine climate. The elevation zones in the Andes are known by their Spanish names. The lowest zone is called the Tierra Caliente, or hot country. Above that is a zone called Tierra Templada, or cool country. Next comes the Tierra Fría, or cold country. And the highest elevation is known as the Tierra Helada, which means frost country. The link between climate and elevation is based on two factors. The first factor is solar energy, which is the heat and light emitted by the sun that warms Earth's surface. Some solar energy is also reflected by Earth back into the atmosphere, with the air closest to the surface absorbing most of the reflected heat. The second factor is the force of gravity. Gravity pulls air into the atmosphere down toward Earth, which results in the air becoming denser at lower elevations. The denser the air, the more heat it can absorb. As you move higher, the air becomes thinner and holds less heat. For every 1,000 foot rise in elevation, the temperatures of the air drops by about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The higher you go in the Andes Mountains, the cooler the temperature becomes. This is true even in regions that are near the equator. For example, both of Ecuador's two largest cities, Guayaquil and Quito, lie near the equator. Guayaquil has an annual average temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, but Quito's average temperature is much cooler, just 57 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason for the difference is elevation. Guayaquil is located at sea level, whereas Quito sits at an elevation of 9,300 feet. One city lies in the Tierra Caliente, the other in the Tierra Fría. Here are pictures of Ecuador's two largest cities. They are both located near the equator, but Guayaquil, which is the top photo, and Quito, which is our bottom photo, have different climates because their elevations are different. Guayaquil is closer to the sea level, so it has more of a tropical climate. We can see the little tropical trees. But Quito has a much cooler climate because it sits at an elevation of 9,350 feet. So we see more kind of trees that we're used to. We're going to delve into the four different zones in our mountain range. The first one we're going to talk about is the Tierra Caliente. It's the lowest elevation zone in the Central Andes. The conditions here are more tropical. People dress in lighter clothing. They have houses that open up to the air so you can get the air coming in your windows. But they also have tropical diseases like malaria. A worker is picking bananas on a plantation in Ecuador. The temperature is high, so he stops frequently to wipe the sweat from his brow. He must also watch out for spiders, because tarantulas often hide within banana stalks. A tarantula bite may not be deadly, but it is extremely painful. This banana plantation is located in the Tierra Caliente. Consisting mostly of tropical lowlands, this elevation zone lies at the foot of the Andes, on both the eastern and western sides. People who live in the Tierra Caliente must adapt to a hot, year-round climate. The Tierra Caliente is the lowest of the four elevation zones of the Andes, extending from sea level to approximately 3,000 feet. The climate of this zone is generally hot and humid, with the average temperature ranging from 75 degrees to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Broadleaf evergreen forests cover the eastern slopes of the Andes Mountains, heading into the Amazon River Basin. On the western slopes of the Andes, the natural vegetation ranges from lush rainforests to tropical grasslands. The Pacific coast of Peru is different. Although this area is also situated within the tropics, it receives little rainfall, and the land is mostly desert. Great sand dunes rise up in some places, whereas other parts are flat and rocky. However, where there is water from rivers or streams, the vegetation is tropical. The tropical heat of the Tierra Caliente can make it an extremely difficult place to live. As a result, the area is less populated than the cooler, higher elevation zones. Some inhabitants are descended from the Africans who were brought by the Spanish to labor on large plantations as slaves. Indigenous peoples also live in some parts of the tropical rainforest. Farmers plant crops that can do well in the heat, with some of the most common crops being bananas, rice, and sugarcane. People dress in light clothing and they live in houses that are open to the cooling breezes. Their houses are often constructed of bamboo or wood with palm thatch roofs, and some houses have been raised on stilts to provide protection against flooding. The pleasant uplands Tierra Templada. The Tierra Templada is the second elevation zone in the Andes. It has a pleasant, spring-like climate year-round. This mild weather appealed to European settlers. Some of the largest cities in Latin America are found at this elevation zone. In the rolling hills of Ecuador's Tierra Templada, gardeners raising flowers tend long rows of carnations, daisies, and roses. The flowers they grow will be shipped to buyers thousands of miles away. In fact, many of the roses enjoyed by Americans on Valentine's Day come from Ecuador, because the country's mild weather provides the perfect climate for cultivating flowers. The Tierra Templada is the second elevation zone of the Andes. It lies between approximately 3,000 and 6,000 feet above sea level. At these elevations, the climate is temperate, with temperatures on average ranging from 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, with rarely any frost. This pleasant weather lasts throughout the year, which is why people often call the Tierra Templada the land of eternal spring. In this zone, the types of vegetation change with elevation. At the lower elevations, tropical plants such as palms, bamboo, and jungle vines are quite common, whereas at higher elevations, broadleaf evergreen forests are typical. The mild climate of the Tierra Templada makes it a good place to live, and as a result, this elevation zone is more populated than the Tierra Caliente. Many of the people who live here are mestizos, which are a mixture of indigenous and European peoples. European cultural influences are strong within the Tierra Templada. Farmers in this zone choose their crops based on elevation. At lower levels, they grow heat-loving crops like bananas and oranges. Higher up, they grow corn, beans, and other vegetables, as well as flowers for export. However, the main commercial crop of the Tierra Templada is coffee, because the conditions here are ideal for growing high-quality coffee beans. Most of the coffee is grown on small farms, but there are also large coffee plantations. People who live in the Tierra Templada have adapted their housing and dressed to the comfortable climate. They live in solid homes made of concrete, brick, or plaster and covered with tile roofs. More well-off residents may live on large estates called haciendas. During the heat of the day, people wear light clothing, but they switch to warmer clothing for the cool mornings and evenings. The cool highlands, Tierra Fria. The Tierra Fria reaches elevations of 12,000 feet. Many native peoples live in this zone. Over centuries, they have developed larger lungs to take in more oxygen from the thin air at these heights. 500 years ago, the centers of the Inca Empire were located at this level. A woman rises early in the highland city of Cusco, Peru, located in the Tierra Fria. Here, the morning air is cold. The woman puts on a warm sweater and shawl and heads off to the market to buy food, walking down ancient stone streets built by her ancestors, the Incas. A light frost on the stones makes them slippery, so she steps carefully. She is accustomed to life in the highlands. Covering much of the central Andes Mountains, the Tierra Fria elevation zone lies between 6,000 and 12,000 feet. The average temperatures within this zone vary from 55 degrees to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but the nights are colder. At higher elevations, the temperatures often dip below freezing. Mountains and valleys are the main physical features of the Tierra Fria elevation zone. The mountains are steep and rugged, but flat basins and plateaus can be found among the peaks. A high plateau, called the Altiplano, lies at an average elevation of over 11,000 feet between Peru and Bolivia. This plateau contains Lake Titicaca, the world's highest navigable lake, or a lake that is both big and deep enough for large boats. Lake Titicaca is rumored to hold hidden treasure, according to legends that say the Incas threw gold into the lake to hide it from the Spanish invaders. Vegetation within the Tierra Fria depends partly on the amount of rainfall. In some places, enough precipitation occurs to support dense forests of pines and other conifers. In other places, the land is so dry that only shrubs and grasses can survive there. Elevation is another factor that affects what grows where. The tree line in the central Andes lies between 10,000 and 12,000 feet. The tree line is the highest elevation at which trees will grow. Approximately half the population of the Central Andes are indigenous people. Most of these people live in the Tierra Fria. The two main indigenous groups are the Quechua and the Aymara. Both of these groups were once part of the Inca Empire. Over the centuries, the native peoples of the Andes have adapted to life at high elevations. They wear warm woolen clothes to protect themselves from the cold. They also build thick-walled houses out of stone or adobe brick. Even their bodies have adapted to high elevations, as they have developed larger lungs that can draw more oxygen from the thin mountain air. Farmers have adapted their practices to the highland environment. They grow crops that do well at high elevation, such as potatoes, wheat, barley, corn, apples, and pears. Farmers also use terracing to carve fields out of steep hillsides, building walls on the slopes and filling them in with soil to create flat land for planting. They irrigate these terraces with mountain streams. This method of farming has been employed for many centuries, including by the Incas, who used terracing to build a great civilization. Here's a famous Inca terrace. See if you can figure out what this is. Well, in the 1400s, the Incas created advanced civilizations in the Andes. This picture here are the ruins of Machu Picchu, an Inca city in Peru. If you notice, you can see the terraced fields at the edges of the cities. So it's like these, see here, these little, look like stepping stones of land. But that's Machu Picchu. Another sign of adaptation to life at high elevations is vertical trade, which is the trade of farm products between the higher and lower elevation zones of the Andes Mountains. Highland farmers cannot grow crops from the lower zones, such as bananas, oranges, and tomatoes. Therefore, traders bring those products up to the highland markets. The traders also take highland crops, such as potatoes and wheat, down to the lowland markets. Through vertical trade, people who live in one elevation zone have access to foods grown in other elevation zones, which enable them to achieve a more balanced and varied diet. The icy high elevations, Tierra Helada. This is our final stop, our 4 zones. The Tierra Helada is the highest zone of the Central Andes. Conditions here are more harsher than anywhere else. The climate is cold and vegetation is sparse. It means there's not much there. People grow hardy crops like quinoa, a grain that is rich in protein. They also work in mines. The mines of Bolivia were once among the richest of the world. Every year, many Quechua Indians gather at a sanctuary high in the mountains of the Cusco region to worship the Apus, or mountain gods. "We make offerings to the mountains," says one pilgrim, asking them to send water for our crops and livestock. The sanctuary is at Quilkipanuku. Quilkipanuku. I'm gonna Google it. Hang on. Alright, we're back. Google was not helpful, so I'm just gonna have to cry. The sanctuary is at Quilkipunku mountain in the Tierra Helada, the highest elevation zone of the Andes. The pilgrims who make this journey have to be careful to walk slowly because the air is very thin. If people move too quickly at this high elevation, they can experience altitude sickness from a lack of oxygen. Altitude sickness can cause headaches, fatigue, shortness of breath, and nausea. The Tierra Helada lies between 12,000 and 15,000 feet, with average temperatures ranging from 20 degrees to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It's an extreme environment with a very cold and windy climate. It often freezes at night, and snow falls at the higher elevation. At the upper edge of the zone lies the snow line, which is the elevation at which permanent snow and ice begins. Above the snow line, snow remains on the ground year-round. Most of the Tierra Helada lies above the tree line, which means that trees are very rare in this elevation zone. The most common forms of plant life are low-lying shrubs and hardy grasses, which are found in the alpine meadows called páramos or punas. The Tierra Helada is a challenging environment for humans, which is why relatively few people live at these extreme elevations. Most of the people who live here are indigenous peoples, like the Quechua and the Aymara. Aymara. People have adapted to life in the Tierra Helada in various ways. As in the Tierra Fria, they dress in warm clothing. They plant the few crops that will grow at high elevations, including a native grain called quinoa, along with certain types of potatoes. Additionally, they raise llamas and alpacas, two types of animals that are related to the camel. Llamas and alpacas produce thick wools for blankets, bags, and clothing. Llamas also make good pack animals for transporting heavy loads across the mountains. Some of the people who live in this elevation zone work in mines. The high Andes have many mineral deposits, including tin, lead, copper, and silver. Working conditions in the mines are quite dangerous, with many miners contracting lung disease or getting injured on the job. However, mining does provide one of the few sources of cash income in this harsh environment. The highest part of the Andes lies just above the Tierra Helada. This cold and rocky region extends from the snow line to the tops of the tallest mountain peaks, and snow and ice cover much of the land. This part of the Andes is generally not inhabited, but it still plays a key role in Andean life. The reason is glaciers. These massive ice fields cover the highest peaks in the Andes, storing large amounts of water above the snow line. In the summer, water from melting glaciers flows down to people living at lower elevations. Streams fed by these glaciers form a crucial part of the water supply. Glaciers are very sensitive to changes in climate. They can grow or shrink depending on the changes in temperature and precipitation that occur over time. If glaciers melt too fast, the result can be disastrous for the people who are living below them. Glaciers don't always behave nicely, said a scientist who studies them. Some glaciers have a nasty habit of storing up large amounts of water and then releasing it suddenly in a massive melt, which may involve floods, landslides, or avalanches. Here we have some satellite images showing a glacier in the Peruvian Andes feeding a nearby lake in the upper right corner. In the image on the right, the glacier has developed a crack. If a large chunk breaks off the glacier, it will cause the lake to overflow, which will then flood the city below in the center left. So here we have our Andes Mountains. This whole thing is the Peruvian Andes. And here we have our glaciers. Down here we have our city. Our glacier has cracked, so if the glacier cracks too much, so much water will flow out and it will come straight on down to our cities. Alright, so in case you were Thomas Jefferson living it up in Monticello and missed out the entire lesson, popped back in at 25 minutes and said, "What did I miss?" Here's what you missed. In this lesson, we read about the 4 elevation zones in the Central Andes Mountains, each of which has its own climate and vegetation. We also learned how people have adapted to the conditions in each zone. In other parts of the world, people have made different adaptations to mountain living. In general, however, relatively few people in the world live at high elevations because the conditions of life there are just too difficult. In the future, mountains may become more attractive to people as places to live. There are signs that the world's climate is getting warmer, and if this warming trend continues, life will change at higher elevations. For example, tree lines and snow lines are likely to rise. As mountains become warmer, more people may choose to live at higher elevations. At the same time, a warmer climate is likely to have a negative effect on mountain glaciers. Well, that's all we've got for Unit 3 Latin America. You can go stop this video and work on your worksheet to finish up. I will see you, what are we doing next? Thursday, we're starting Unit 4, Europe and Russia. So you can join us or stay mellow, doing whatever it is you do in Monticello. Goodbye.